Hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to wrap up the books that I read in November and go through some of the plans that I've got for my reading in December. It's kind of crazy thinking that we're already at December and that I suppose now I'll have to start thinking about some of my favourite books of the year, sort of evaluating books in that way, and thinking about my plans for next year as well. I've got a few rough ideas, but it'll be good to sort of sit down and at least get an idea of where I can kind of see my reading going, at least at the moment, next year. But let's jump into what I read in November. I'm omitting two books because I really included them in the last wrap up. They were technically books I finished in November, but I included them in the October wrap up just because of, I read most of them in October and it made sense at the time. So I'll just jump forward to the books that I finished since then. A couple that were brought up in the random reading update that I made partway through the month. So I finished Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré. I won't say too much about it, but it's a marvellous book. It's probably my favourite le Carré that I've read so far. So a really brilliant book, but certainly one to take slowly, and it's a sort of very slow, meandering kind of book, but I loved it. And I said when I just read this in the last update that it's very rare that le Carré writes an ending that doesn't feel really impactful and really lands and is memorable, and that's certainly the case for Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. It's a wonderful ending that just adds this really beautiful touch to the whole book, even though there's been lots of deception and intrigue and betrayal, and yet there's just this really wonderful note at the end of the book that almost brought me to tears. And then I read the new selected poems of Elizabeth Jennings. Not too much to say about Elizabeth Jennings, really, at least at the moment. I enjoyed her, and I'll give you a taste of her at some point for a Poetry Thursday. I've already included one of her poems in a Poetry Thursday, but that was about 2 or 3 well, yeah, I think 2 years ago now. So I'll give her another go for Poetry Thursday. And then I finished reading the Everyman's Library book, a little anthology volume called Stories of Books and Libraries, which was really, really wonderful. In the update video I made, I went through some of the stories and selections that were included up to that point. And there's lots of really interesting stuff after there. So I think last time I'd reached The Library of Babel by Borges, which is a story that I really love, by Jorge Luis Borges. And then really the main thing that stood out, there were some things that I liked, the main thing that stood out for me in the latter passages was there were excerpts from 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hanff, and it was just wonderful. It's a book that a lot of people on BookTube have talked about, and they enjoy it and love it. I was just watching earlier today John David talking about 84 Charing Cross Road, and he was talking about how I think one of the reasons he read it was because of how much Hannah from Hannah's Books loves it, and I don't know, there's this wonderful sort of atmosphere around the book on BookTube, and yet I still hadn't quite felt that it was a book that I would want to read. But having read the excerpts in here, I've totally changed my mind. So I'll be at some point I'll be looking for a copy of 84 Charing Cross Road, because it from what I've read, it's delightful. And then moving on, I read another John le Carré book. We're currently, back in November there was a reading event called Dr. November, spearheaded by Mark from Book Time with Elvis. So I wanted to read another le Carré, and one of his sort of post Cold War books. I quite like contrasting them, so I like to read at least two le Carré books close together. And so I read The Night Manager, which was one of his first sort of post Cold War books, as I understand it. So it was published in 1993. From what it looks like, one of the first ones that he'd at least finished writing after the Cold War. You can probably correct me if I'm wrong. And the titular night manager is a man called Jonathan Pine. He's an army veteran, and with this being set in the sort of probably late 80s, early 90s. He'd spent some time in Ireland, and there'd been some violence there with the Troubles, he's sort of left, and as the book goes in, you get a better idea of maybe it was that he left the army, and he goes initially into catering, and then into being a hotelier, and then he becomes the night manager of a hotel in Cairo. And when he's there, he becomes involved with the I can't remember I think it's the wife of one of these three brothers who basically own Cairo. This guy is on the board of directors of the hotel, and they're powerful, nasty people, and essentially, I don't know how much of how many details to divulge, but essentially, this woman he's become involved with sort of divulges or sort of entrusts Pine with these documents, with photocopying these documents, that if I remember correctly, prove that her husband is involved with this arms dealer called Roper, essentially Pine tries to get he's promised to keep it all secret to her, but he goes behind her back, he tries to get the British Embassy to do something about it. They shrug their shoulders. Someone sort of leaks to this guy, to Freddie Hamid, this woman's husband, that someone's been trying to blow the whistle on you, and he beats up his wife, and eventually his wife is killed. And so Pine has this feeling of betrayal, and he's really sort of let her down by trying to do the right thing. So he goes off to another hotel, and through happenstance, this man, Dickie or Richard Roper, the arms dealer who was behind the whole thing, is one of the guests at this other hotel that he's gone to work at, and then this sparks him to essentially, out of love and respect and a sense of honour that he has towards Sophie, the woman who was killed, he's going to do whatever is in his power to get his sort of revenge on Roper. And the way he does that is that he, contacts the British consulate he's in Geneva, no, in Zurich, and so he contacts the British embassy there, and ends up liaising with the British Secret Service, and basically becomes sort of an inside man, kind of mole, but he has to become a criminal to do that, and so he goes through so many transformations, and he becomes so many people, in order then that once he's infiltrated Roper's inner circle, there's this sort of backstory of his sort of criminal past. So it's a really interesting book, a really cynical book, I think, and it's it's kind of depressing. Essentially, the bad guys are certain sort of snobbish upper class British guys who have walked into certain positions, in the government and in the establishment, and are then able to look out for their friends who maybe aren't doing everything by the letter of the law, and that's the kind of world that the main characters of the book, that Jonathan Pine and the other sort of secret agents involved in this have to work with to make any kind of a difference. In the end, I thought it was okay. It's certainly not a patch on Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. It doesn't read like a fast-paced thriller or anything like that, but I get the impression with this book that he's trying to at least slightly tailor towards people who would read these sort of tougher, more hard-boiled books. Although I suppose Spy Who Came In From the Cold and sort of other earlier Le Carré books, you get a bit of that. But I don't know, there's a slightly different tone to this, which I think he just sort of developed over time. But yeah, I thought it was okay. I don't really know how much more to say about it, really. I, as usual, the writing itself was good. It's always good. At least it's been good so far with Le Carré. And yeah, I'll leave it there. I don't want to get into too much detail about it. And then I've been reading Saint Augustine's Confessions. I recently finished them off. This is a translation by, let's get his name up again, Edward Bovary Pusey, who was a prominent Catholic, Anglican thinker, or I suppose you'd say Anglo-Catholic thinker of the Victorian period. And I enjoyed the Confessions. I don't really have too much more to say about them than the last time I talked about them. I think it was in the last reading update. Towards the end, there are some really interesting meditations on the nature of time, which I wasn't expecting, but I didn't understand it. But I found it interesting, and this is a book I would like to come back to. I would like to read a more recent translation, because there's something to Pusey's translation that it feels a little artificial to me. It's that, I suppose it's that kind of stilted and sort of artificial, archaic language that's just sort of thrown in there for the sake of a kind of piety. The only way I can really explain it is that this is a really special holy book, so we have to use all our best words and our most complicated syntax to show you how important it is. That may not be the case at all. Maybe he is representing the way that Augustine wrote, but I would like to try a slightly more modern translation, at least to get a better idea of what he's saying, and to understand it a little better. but I enjoyed it, and I'll be back. I'll give him another go later on. Then two poetry books that I finished off just earlier today. After finishing Elizabeth Jennings, I picked up two books of poetry. One poet who was new to me, and then another old, dependable favourite. It just felt good to go back and spend time with a poet I knew. So the poet that was new to me was Octavio Paz, I think a Mexican poet. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 90s. He's a really interesting poet. I prefer him to poets like Pablo Neruda. I haven't read a lot of Pablo Neruda. I could sense a kind of influence from names are going out of my head. Lorca. I could sense a kind of influence from in just the kind of the springiness of everything and the surrealism, at least in the early poetry. And I suppose when Paz started off writing as well, it wasn't that long since Lorca had been writing, or maybe it was around the same time. Can't remember, but certainly it wasn't ancient history. But I liked it, particularly the earlier poems. There are a lot of motifs that come up, a lot of sun, a lot of rock, of trees and roots, and of blood. It starts to feel very sort of hippie, if that's a word, sort of new agey, I suppose. It's the vibe I get. Not that I don't like that, I'm quite partial to it every now and then. And the poetry gets more and more experimental as it goes on, and you get these sort of interesting shapes on the page, but for some of the poems, when read out, work quite well. It gets you to concentrate on certain words over others, so it's not random. And then some of the last poems I enjoyed as well, but yeah, I don't really know how much to say. There's a lot about language and the I suppose sort of contrasting speaking with silence, and with the need to speak being something that comes out of our mortality, and the fact that we're going to die, which I hadn't really thought of in that kind of a way. So an interesting poet, and with each poem there were these familiar symbols, these familiar motifs coming in all the way through his career, and yet they're often applied in new ways and getting to think about these different concepts. And so some of the poems are very loose and they feel very free and of the moment. Some of them are almost like essays, and these sort of it's almost like he's just been reading some philosophy, and he's using the poem as a way to digest what he's just read. And so it's really interesting. I'll be going back to him certainly in the future. And then the old dependable favourite that I was reading was W.B. Yeats. This is the edition of Yeats I've got. It's just a small selection selected by Seamus Heaney, and it's great. That there were a few poems here that I hadn't really spent much time with it in the past. Hadn't really thought about that much in the past. An Irish airman foresees his death. That was one that I loved, and the poem just before it in here, in memory of Major Robert Gregory. I think I enjoyed that quite a lot. I seem to remember quite liking Ego Dominus Tuus, or Tuus. I won't go flicking through them all. But later on, Meditations in Time of Civil War, really enjoyed that. A Dialogue of the Self and Soul, really enjoyed that. I'd read his poem Byzantium quite a few times before, and it's one of those poems where I still don't get it, but I'm feeling less alienated by it every time I read it. And some of the last poems towards the end, like Under Ben Bullen and News from the Delphic Oracle, The Circus Animals Desertion, and The Man and the Echo, which is one of my favourites. I'm just reeling off titles, but I love Yeats, and he's one of these comfort poets, really. And there's a nice big Everyman volume of the complete Yeats, or the complete poems of Yeats, because he wrote other things as well. And it'd be interesting to see what else is there, because from the first book, Crossways from 1889, there's a poem in here called The Indian Upon God. I think he's using Indian in a quite sort of old-fashioned way, I expect, so someone sort of a native inhabitant of a undeveloped country, I suppose, would be a way we describe it now. Or maybe maybe he's thinking of a Native American. I'm not entirely sure, but it's just a really, I really like this poem, and it's essentially about how different animals might envision their own version of God, which again sounds a bit weird, and from a philosophical or theological sort of point, it's a bit flimsy and weird, but as a poem I quite like it. So that's Yeats and Octavio Paz, and that's everything that I read in November. I've got some kind of tentative plans. I'm becoming more and more tentative with the second half of these videos, and going into my plans for the next month. Just finding that being flexible is a bit more useful for me, I suppose. But at the moment, I'm currently reading two books. I'm not sure which poetry book to pick up next. I'm hoping to read some Wallace Stevens with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics. But I think, mostly me, I've been quite disorganised and forgetful with it. I'm not sure if we'll be getting around to it soon, or whether it'll be something that happens next year. Not too sure. And so, sort of watch this space in terms of my poetry reading in the near future. But I picked up the Orestieian trilogy by Aeschylus. Up until this point, I've not read any Greek drama. I've read some smatterings of Plato, and I've read Homer, and that's more or less it for my reading of ancient Greek literature. I need to get to Herodotus and people like that eventually as well, but we'll get there. But I've been really enjoying this. I've read the first play, Agamemnon. Spoiler alert, Agamemnon dies. And it's translated by Philip Vallacott, and it's got a really, really good introduction. And he just goes through the whole story from the birth of the gods, and sort of the contentions with Titans and stuff, and with Kronos, and I suppose, would you call them the Olympian gods gaining the ascendancy, and then essentially sort of going from Prometheus, stealing fire. This whole chain of events that lead to the Trojan War, and then to the Oristieian trilogy. And so that was just really, really fun. I really enjoyed that introduction, and then he goes into a little more depth into each play. So been really enjoying this so far. I'm just going to pause so I can cough. Okay, coughing over. And then I was hoping to start a buddy read with John David. We were going to read Misha Glenny's book, The Balkans, a history of that region. Unfortunately, John's got a lot on at the moment, so we've we'll read it together eventually. I was thinking of another book to read. I want to have another non-fiction book on the go, and I was looking around at my shelves, and it's a really silly way to choose what to read. I wanted to look for one that was of a similar size. So even though it's a totally different subject, I picked up the Western Canon by Harold Bloom. I've just read the preface so far, just going into why he's choosing the authors. Essentially, if you're thinking of representative authors from the literature of Western Europe, or just of Europe and America, the Americas, I suppose, with the writers he includes. There could be so many writers included in that, and so he's had to whittle it down, and I can't remember how many there are, something like 12 writers he's really focusing on, of a range of disciplines. So he really starts off with Dante, but for him, Shakespeare is at the middle of everything. And then some of his old favourites keep coming up. There's Cervantes and Milton and Dr. Johnson, Jane Austen, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, Tolstoy, Freud, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Proust, and it sort of goes on. But he was saying that one of the reasons, or one of the ways that for him he can see a certain work as being great is strangeness, and this kind of idea of being at home in a book, and yet everything about it is uncanny. And it's that quality. And then he turns it on its head for Shakespeare, because he says that his assessment of Shakespeare is that Shakespeare takes us out of the familiar place, out of home, but somehow makes it work and makes it familiar. I'm not entirely sure what I think of that assessment. It's not a way of addressing that issue of how we decide what is a great work of art or a great work of literature. It's not a question I have really tried to pin down too much myself. I just try to appreciate something when I notice that it's good, or I notice that at least I've enjoyed it. So I'll be putting a little bookmark there in my head, and I'll see what I think. This is certainly going to be a book where I think I'm going to be, at least in my head, talking back to it a lot, and there's going to be a lot of conversation. So it might be a relatively long read. I might stretch it out, and we'll see how that goes. And then very quickly, a few books that I'd like to get to in December. Tove Janssen, The Invisible Child and the Fir Tree. So some Moomin stories. Seems very Christmassy, and I love Tove Janssen, so that's certainly one for at some point in December. And then I'd really quite like to get to Solenoid in December as well. So I'm not sure how or when I'd fit it in. Maybe sooner rather than later. Maybe once I've finished Aeschylus. We'll see how that goes. And then one that I'm saving for probably some point towards the end of the month. I'd like to read The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, an author that I never really thought too much about reading until essentially discovering that Pat from Book Chat with Pat, she really loves this author. And sometimes when you're watching these videos on BookTube, a person's enthusiasm for a certain writer can become infectious, and you just want to find out for yourself, what they're like. And that's the case with J.D. Salinger. So and I'm given to understand that the book takes place around Christmas time, and so I'm going to try and read it at some point around then. And then there's an event going on, sort of resurrecting a Christmas tradition or something like that. I can't quite remember its name. I've heard, I think Gavin from Genre Books talk about it, and Debs from Rainer Read stuff, and I think maybe Mark from Book Time with Elvis, and probably quite a few others. And it's reviving the tradition of reading ghost stories, particularly around Christmas and the New Year. And I haven't really thought too much as to how much I'd like to engage with the event. I know for a group read, they'll be reading a short story by Elizabeth Gaskell, somewhere around that one of those dark books by my finger is a book of Gaskell's ghost stories that Sean D. Standfast gave to me. So I could join in with that and read some Gaskell ghost stories, and I could read, I could download some M.R. James onto my Kindle as well. So I haven't thought too much about what I might read for that, but it sounds like fun, so I might give that a go. And as well, around Christmas time, certainly last year, I read a few books that, for want of a better phrase, were a present to myself. And I read some Patrick Leigh Fermor and some Edmund de Waal, two writers that I love, and I can remember reading them around Christmas time, and it was last year, and it was just great. I was really enjoying it, and I might try and do something similar this year. And I've been feeling this pull back towards Dylan Thomas recently, so I might reread Under Milk Wood at some point around Christmas, or maybe I'll save it for that period between Christmas and the New Year, which is one of my favourite weeks of the whole year, particularly now that I'm in a job where it's quite quiet at that time of year, whereas in my last job it was always really busy, so I couldn't just chill. So yeah, I might reread Under Milk Wood. When I was flicking through this, I found something that I was using as a bookmark the last time I read it. I won't open it up to show you the details because it has private information on it. But I was using a polling card. I don't know if this is something that's people in other countries have, but in the UK, for a general election, you register to vote and you receive your polling card, and you bring that along with you when you're casting your ballot. And this is my polling card for a general... Is it a general election? Yes. An election of Member of Parliament for the Cardiff Central constituency back on the 8th of June 2017. And I can remember that day, and I can remember I was wearing this jumper, and the Conservatives won. And I was very conscious that I was wearing blue, and so I went and changed clothes. But yeah, that was just a random thing that I found in a book that is not interesting at all. So I'll leave it there. I hope there was something interesting in there. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.